Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Caitlin Hughes, and it's my great pleasure to chair this afternoon's session, which is looking at moving beyond criminalisation. Now, this topic of moving beyond criminalisation is one that, I'm actually surprised we don't have a full room yet, but I have no doubt that by the end of this session it will be very full, because as we heard in the opening plenary, the topic of criminalisation continues to remain a very critical area where that is needed in terms of improving harm reduction across the globe. So it's wonderful that the session that we have today is bringing together people from different parts of the globe to speak about this topic, but also to speak about it in different ways. So we've got people who are talking about the criminalisation or decriminalisation of use and possession offences. We've got people who are looking at this issue in relation to the decriminalisation of access to harm reduction services, and then from Kenya, and then we have a final presentation that is looking at justice systems and advancing humane drug policy in the Philippines. So this session is going to be is going virtually, as well as for the people in the room. So anyone who is online, you can also add questions to the chat, and otherwise, I look forward to hearing all of your questions and answers at the end. So we're going to start off by hearing from Nicole Luongo, who has a master's in sociology, but is now working at the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. And she's going to be looking at decriminalisation done right. And she's talking about the recent reforms in British Columbia, which I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with, but also very interested in hearing more about the perspectives of people who use drugs on the ground. So I'll pass over to you if you would like to stand on the lectern, or...
do I have the option of staying here? Or is that standard? Okay.
I think, it might be best if you stand up just so that you can control the slides.
Okay. Can you tell I don't do this very... Thank you. And in terms of controlling the slides, how do I do that? Anyone?
Yep.
Tech support? So just with this?
Yep, so you should be able to go forward. Or that way? Forward? Yep.
They might have turned it off. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. No worries.
All right. So, hello everyone. My name is Nicole Luongo with the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge where I'm from. I live and work on what is colonially known as Vancouver, Canada, but what is really the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Canada has a settler colonial history very analogous to that of Australia's. And of course, our drug laws and policies are intimately intertwined with that. If I had more time to discuss that, I would, but paying heed to time. Just a brief overview here. I'm going to talk about kind of our current drug policy landscape in Canada. I'll probably skip over models of decrim and regulation for time, then talk about decriminalization done right, which is a user-led and rights-based path for drug policy that was compiled by a national network, and then talk about how that has been implemented in British Columbia and some of the goings-on there. So right now, Canada's kind of federal regime of prohibition is called the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. It criminalizes the simple possession of a variety of controlled substances that are scheduled according to their perceived risk or danger, which again is heavily rooted in colonialism, racism, etc. The CDSA also criminalizes trafficking, as well as the importing of certain scheduled substances and the production of those substances, even if it is for personal use. There have been reforms in recent years to the CDSA. Notably, Canada did legalize and regulate cannabis in 2018. And so the possession, production, and sale of cannabis is legal within certain parameters to consumers 18 and above. Also notable is that that has been done under a market or a for-profit model, and lots of the tenets when it comes to redistributive justice, equity provisions are largely absent from our model. I'm going to skip over Bill C-5, but note that most recently some mandatory minimum penalties for drug-related offenses were removed from the criminal code and the CDSA. And some of you in this room are very familiar, and some of you may be familiar with what we call safer supply in Canada. I know there's a panel onto itself for safer supply. It's a novel intervention wherein people who are deemed at high risk of fatal overdose are provided with pharmaceutical-grade alternatives to the illegal drug supply. Very, very minor kind of access to this already existed, but at the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, our federal government kind of created new pathways for implementing that. However, as you will hear if you attend anything else on Canadian safer supply, it is heavily rooted in the constructs of addiction medicine. So the scalability, reach, and uptake of it has been sorely limited, and even in provinces that have implemented pathways for accessing it, that access remains fractured, uneven, and wholly inadequate. And I offer that A, because it's fact-based and important, but B, because I think Canada has a really strong kind of investment from the powers that be in presenting ourselves as this liberal kind of panacea. You know, we are a nation that prides ourselves on being benevolent. We often compare and contrast ourselves to our neighbors to the south, the United States, and we have identical social problems, albeit we may be a bit quieter about them. And I think kind of the mask that Canadians wear, at least those in positions of power, is really important to kind of puncture, because the rights of people who use drugs continue to be violated, as do the rights of many other targeted populations. So turning to advocacy now. I do work for the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. We are an organization, but we have been in coalition with a number of kind of both drug user groups and civil society organizations for the last few years in particular. And as movement towards decriminalization was kind of getting off the ground in regional ways, because we have our federal kind of landscape of prohibition, and then health is actually regulated by the provinces and territories. So there are huge regional disparities there from province to territory. And municipalities at the same time are also starting to talk about applying to the federal government for exemptions under the CDSA for decrim. And so we saw kind of the extent to which these inequities were being exacerbated, and certain groups were being left behind, certain regions were certainly being left behind, and we came together and over the period of a year and a bit produced what we've called Decriminalization Done Right, a rights-based path for drug policy. And I will just talk very briefly about the contents, but I'm also interested in the procedure and the procedural elements that went into it. So the platform, again, was produced in conjunction with people who have lived and living experience of criminalized drug use, and organizations who represent those folks, as well as many others. So to us, and what kind of exists in this platform, is that decriminalization done right means full decriminalization for both personal possession and what we deem necessity trafficking. So as I said, trafficking of any kind is criminalized under the CDSA, but necessity trafficking we consider sharing, selling, or splitting drugs for subsistence purposes to support personal use or to provide a safe supply. We know from research and anecdotal evidence that the vast majority of people who sell drugs do so for these purposes. And that people who sell drugs also participate in networks of community care and save lives themselves. And that's really vital to emphasize. The demonization of the drug seller is a dominant narrative, including in Canada. The platform emphasizes redistribution of resources from law enforcement and harmful drug laws into non-coercive and culturally appropriate community-led programs and services that promote health and human rights. And that, of course, includes Indigenous-led programming. It does not include administrative penalties such as fines or health assessments, and that has been a sticking point, I think, globally. Even in Canada, people still cite the Portugal model as being something that was or could be wildly successful. We know that diversion, coercive drug treatment, whether that be through courts or otherwise, are not evidence-informed. They're re-traumatizing, and they exacerbate risk of death. Our drug supply in Canada is highly toxic. We don't have anything resembling heroin and haven't for a number of years. It's fentanyl and its analogs, benzodiazepines, tranquilizers, and the death rates are staggering. And we know that forced treatment or involuntary institutionalization increases that risk. We also emphasize the automatic expungement of convictions for both possession and necessity trafficking. Sorry, just trying to get into my timer here. Clear rules and limitations around what police can and cannot do. We have large pockets of Canada that rely on discretionary enforcement, where decriminalization has maybe been informally implemented for years or longer, but police still very much target visibly poor, racialized people. And finally, strong protections against net widening or upcharging, so that people who maybe would have been charged with simple possession are now not suddenly charged with trafficking. And I just want to talk about British Columbia briefly. So again, that is where I'm based. And BC and Vancouver in particular is a fairly unique environment. Our provincial government, the NDP, is ostensibly progressive. I say ostensibly heavily. We are the first province to adopt kind of pathways for accessing safe supply, and if you ask the powers that be, they will say that it is available widely. That is a lie. Huge disparities between urban and rural contexts. So we are a big province geographically and in terms of a diversity of demographics. And in places like the downtown east side of Vancouver, where I am, there is a rich history of community activism and resistance. You know, the downtown east side saw North America's first safe injection site receive legal protections. Yesterday, it was referenced at the opening that the Drug User Liberation Front in Vancouver hands out illegally acquired but safe tested drugs on a non-prescriber basis, and they do so at great personal risk. So there's that, and there are northern areas, there are small towns where not a municipal police force but our federal police force are kind of given free rein to impose as much violence as they want. And one thing I want to mention that's critical, I think, is that many of the reforms that we've seen in British Columbia are co-opted and diluted versions of what people who use drugs actually want. And so there we have kind of this dialectic of people advocating for radical change, and those demands being taken up by government, they have to be, and then being kind of watered down beyond recognition. And then when they invariably don't work or don't work as they could, that gives fodder to more conservative regions and politicians to say, see, what those kind of wackos in British Columbia are doing isn't working, let's just further criminalize. And that is kind of the ongoing tension we have between BC and the rest of Canada and throughout Canada. So just a very brief timeline. In 2016, in April of 2016, it was just the anniversary, our province did declare a public health emergency. That is really when fentanyl kind of took over the illegal drug market. It has since gotten exponentially worse. But through a series of kind of events, I'm going to skip ahead. Basically, in January of 2023, we did implement a 3-year decriminalization pilot. I'm emphasizing pilot, and some of us call it diet decrim or decrim light. And the major kind of issues with this model are that the demands of people who use drugs, again, were diluted. And so although the kind of threshold that they were advocating for was much higher, we ultimately do have a 2.5 gram cumulative threshold, meaning all your drugs together can only weigh 2.5 grams. And all of the kind of problems that we foresaw are potentially coming into fore. And I'll just emphasize that with our Decrim Done Right platform, some of the lessons learned after the process in BC, where there was a lack of accountability to drug user groups, a lack of transparency, and an ongoing lack of transparency, and how the Decrim pilot is actually being evaluated, is that we need to control the messaging around it. When politicians speak to media, they present Decrim as a solution to the drug poisoning crisis. It's not. We in this room are aware that Decrim is primarily geared towards reducing engagement with the criminal justice system and other harmful systems, but it is not the introduction of a legally regulated drug supply, and that is what we need to be pushing for. However, when politicians talk about it, they frame it as a response to drug poisoning. There has been political backlash. We are seeing our provincial government move towards advocating for involuntary treatment or an institutionalization writ large. And so although we want to emphasize the need for a public health model, that is distinct from an individual medical model. And that is something I see replicated everywhere, where addiction is poorly defined with no universally agreed upon definition, and claiming that addiction treatment is the solution to systemic drivers of oppression is simply incorrect. And we have seen municipalities push back, those conservative municipalities that I've referenced. Although the 2016 ministerial order did declare that municipalities cannot undermine the introduction of overdose prevention services or health-related services related to the drug poisoning crisis, they have been, and they continue to try. And so we've seen punitive bylaws erected where suddenly public drug consumption is criminalized in a way that it wasn't, with a $200 fine attached in ways that it wasn't. And we have this really complex landscape with every level of government, as well as health authorities and all these other entities that are supposed to work together and often kind of pass the buck. So on our end, the lessons learned are, again, just emphasizing that we need to control that narrative, get into mainstream media as much as we can, and debunk myths that kind of the general public are not able to parse out the nuances of themselves, and continue to advocate for a fully legally regulated drug supply. And I will leave it at that because I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Nicole. I have certainly got lots of questions after that, and I'm sure those of you in the room do as well. But for the moment, I'm going to pass on to our second speaker, who is Teddy Wandera. Now, Teddy is a lawyer and a drug policy reform advocate from Kenya. He has advocated for the rights of key populations and persons who use drugs since February 2014, and he is currently working as the project coordinator at the Caucus on Harm Reduction and Drug Policy Reforms. So today he'll be speaking about Unity for Purpose, a case on the decriminalisation of harm reduction in Kenya.
Thank you very much. I'd like to apologize in advance if I yawn. I'm a bit jet lagged, but so my outline for the presentation would start with a brief description of the caucus and what problem we encountered as Kenyans advocating for drug policy reforms, what we did about it, and the way forward. So the Caucus on Harm Reduction and Drug Policy Reforms in Kenya, also known as the Caucus, is an initiative that brings together individuals and institutional advocates of drug policy reforms. The Caucus creates a platform for organizations and individuals to enable members to leverage on diversity, expertise, and skills to catalyze law reforms in Kenya. Our biggest strength is that we are able to maximize on available limited resources to coordinate advocacy efforts and ensure complementary strategies are adopted in law policy and enforcement issues affecting drug users in Kenya. So our biggest problem, and we've discussed this in various conferences, was that Section 5 of our Narcotics, Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Control Act criminalized provision of harm reduction services, such as the needle and syringe exchange program. And this continually led to persons with problematic drug use dropping out of harm reduction outreach programs, and it also exposed our outreach workers to arrest because provision of needles and syringes was expensive. It was not expensive, it was illegal, thereby leading to the spread of HIV and hepatitis amongst community members. So an opportunity presented itself, and I'm saying an opportunity because since 2014, we've been trying to advocate for the amendment of the Act. And Parliament didn't want to hear anything of that. The government didn't want to hear anything of that. The Ministry of Health preferred to bury their heads under the sand. So harm reduction services are being provided as goodwill by the government and it was not embedded in the law. So in 2019, a member of Parliament tried amending the bill to heighten sentences for traffickers. And we got an opportunity because our constitution provides that amendment of any laws, there has to be public participation. And so we came all together so as to tackle that. So we went to them and told them, okay, we don't have a problem with you heightening sentences for traffickers, but would also want, because the law as is going to expose persons who use drugs to further human rights violations, as much as you want us to believe that it's only to target the traffickers. So with support from Open Society and ESHRI, we embarked on a project where we brought together all like-minded organizations and individuals keen on drug policy reforms under this initiative, and that was the birth of the caucus. So through this initiative, we leveraged on the wealth of expertise and advocacy. Our members have different expertise through their work on harm reduction from the beginning of harm reduction in Kenya. So they've developed a lot of expertise. So we leveraged on their wealth of expertise on advocacy, and jointly developed memorandums for legislators. We conducted engagement meetings with legislators from various parliamentary committees. And we also developed simplified memorandums that outreach workers used to build capacities of persons who use drugs during outreach visits. So as much as we put in so much effort on this, the bill passed without our recommendations. So we didn't sit down and cry over this. It catapulted us to our next phase of our project, where we decided to make noise, and a lot of noise, through the media. We didn't go to the streets. We were scared of further human rights violations if we went to the streets, so we just decided to make noise using the media. And again, we leveraged on our expertise brought by the membership, and we embarked on an aggressive media campaign. We sent everyone everywhere, to every radio station, to every TV station, to all newspapers to write opinion pieces with one key message: persons who use drugs need medical intervention and not incarceration. Good news. The first report we got was the president has refused to assent to the bill and has referred it to the Ministry of Health for recommendations. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Health did not give us... So unfortunately, the Ministry of Health did not give us room to discuss with them their recommendations, but obviously they gave good recommendations, because after that, once we had the bill was passed, when we bought copies of the bill to read it, sentences for cannabis had been reduced. Cannabis possession had been reduced from 10 years to 5 years, and they also gave an option of a fine of about $800. So this is an amount we can sit down and raise to ensure you're not incarcerated. So WhatsApp groups, we raise funds at least, so I can reduce the amount of people who are in jail as a result of cannabis possession. Then they also introduced, before our law, the person charged with drug possession was supposed to prove that the drugs he had were for his personal use and not trafficking. But now a quantity was produced, quantities for personal use, that was 1 gram. So if you're found with 1 gram, it's for personal use. More than 1 gram, it's a bit unfair, but at least it's a win compared to what we had before. Then introduction of committal to appropriate court-appointed treatment programs. Then deletion of Section 5D, which criminalized the needle and syringe exchange program. And finally, reduced sentences for being found in areas where people consume drugs from 10 years to 5 years. So our way forward, using this model, we want to continue to build our membership, to bring in members of the palliative care, advocates of palliative care, communities with intersecting vulnerabilities such as sex workers and LGBTIQ community members, so as to increase our expertise and advocacy base. Thank you very much.
I think that was an excellent second presentation, and again, I'm sure lots of questions in the room. Our third presenter is Mary. Mary Cathy. Yes. Mary Cathy is one of the founders and the executive director of Street Law Philippines, an organisation that is working for humane drug policies and access to justice in the Philippines. So she will be presenting today on linking communities with the justice system to advance humane drug policy in the Philippines. And she will be speaking without PowerPoint, which I'm sure you'll all appreciate.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, everyone. I'm Cathy Alvarez from Cebu City in the Philippines. Our team decided not to use a PowerPoint presentation because it would be mostly consist of flashing photos, and we wanted to protect the communities that we work with from unnecessary exposure. Those of you who were present at the 2019 Harm Reduction Conference would probably remember that the Philippines experienced some of the most egregious human rights violations in the name of the war on drugs. This is a reality, and I've been asked often if has anything changed now that Duterte is no longer president. Well, our laws remain the same. And so while there may be some improvements, it doesn't mean that things have gotten better, because our punitive laws continue to facilitate human rights violations of people who use drugs. But I'd like to tell you a story that hopefully would leave us with a little bit of hope. We recognize that we are a very small community of drug policy reform and human rights activists in the Philippines. And we also know enough about our political system to accept that it will take a long time before our existing drug laws would change. But in the meantime, we needed to do something to at least push for spaces where we could introduce a little bit of change towards more humane drug policy. And since we are an organization of lawyers, we decided to start with the institutions that we move in, which is the criminal justice system. And so in 2020, right before the lockdowns were declared, we planned a learning session for a group of progressive judges coming from all over the Philippines, many of whom were handling drugs courts, or at least handling drug-related offenses in their courts. So the plan was to create a space where the judges would be able to interact safely with communities of people who use drugs outside of the criminal justice institutions, outside of the criminal justice system, because we wanted the judges to see beyond their case folders, there are human beings. We would be able to convince them, despite the widespread stigma and discrimination experienced by people who use drugs from all over the criminal justice system and from Filipino society in general, we were hoping that they would support our call towards changes in policy. Unfortunately, our government declared lockdown, I think, a week right before our scheduled learning sessions. In fact, we'd already paid the deposit at the venue, and we had to change our plans. Maybe it was serendipitous because we had to shift to an online platform where we organized a series. Instead of just having a two-day training, we managed to make it into a series of Friday night sessions running for, I think, a little over a month, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 6 to 8 sessions. And every Friday night, we would have these 30 judges from all over the Philippines in a Zoom with discussing different topics in relation to drug policy and human rights. Because it was online, we were also able to invite experts from outside of the Philippines to talk about different ways of addressing, different drug policies. Because it was important for us to show the judges that the things that are happening in the Philippines now, they don't have to be that way. that there are other ways, there are other things that are happening in other parts of the world. We also made sure that part of the program would be a space where a Filipino person who uses drugs would be able to safely share their experience, not just as a victim of the criminal justice system, but also as a human being facing stigma and discrimination. And so we did this for a series of Friday nights where we would always extend. Our session would be supposed to be from 5:30 in the afternoon, right after the courts close, only until maybe 7 in the evening, but we would always extend up to maybe 9 because the judges also had a lot of questions and stories to tell. How do we say this? We were really surprised at how engaged the judges were. Apparently, they also needed a space where they could also share their frustrations with the justice system. And we were happy that they found the space to be safe enough where they would tell us about how they would try to dismiss cases and make sure that they would have very vivid descriptions of the lives of the people involved in these cases, just so they would not be targeted for killings. And how they would grieve over those cases that they dismissed and ordered released, and then they would find in the news weeks later who would be dead. And we knew then that maybe the judges just have a different environment that they're moving in, but they are just as traumatized as those of us who are working in the human rights sector. They also had to face accusations of being called narco judges when they have a very high dismissal rate of drug-related offenses. These are things that we don't see in the news. We don't hear studies about the situation of our own justice system. And many of the stories we also were hearing for the first time. And so it gave us, lawyers and advocates, also a glimpse of what we could do, what we could improve to help the communities that we work with navigate the justice system. I am very surprised personally at the reception that we got. When we planned this, we were saying that if we just get one judge to say that there's a problem with our existing situation, if just one of them admits that, then all of the efforts that we have put in would have been worth it. But I attended an online General Assembly of the judges, and I was surprised. One of them was screaming on the screen, "I only impose the minimum penalties now." And she said if it were possible not to impose penalties at all, she would do that. We have a very traumatic relationship with the criminal justice system. So many of the communities of people who use drugs in the Philippines are still incarcerated. In fact, at a session before this, I was just telling the story of our recent jail visit where the women were asking us, why is it that our cases scheduled in 2021, the next hearing is already in 2026? This is in 2021, and your next hearing is in 2026. That's the kind of congested court system that we are facing from the sheer volume of drug-related offenses that are being filed. Because our drug laws continue to be severely punitive. But we wanted to get our judges to say, maybe we don't have to send people to jail. Maybe there's another way. Maybe we don't have to be worried about being labeled as narco judges in the first place. And so this January, as the Philippines started opening up, we wanted to bring the safe space further. We invited, again, different judges from all over the Philippines to attend face-to-face our first in-person activity, where they are co-participants with women who use drugs. At an orientation on human rights and drug policy. We wanted to get the judges out of the courts, not as experts, but to be training participants, and the people beside them in the room were coming from communities of women who use drugs. We wanted them to share over lunch, over dinner, what it was like to have to take on, their experiences with the justice system. We wanted them to interact, not as judge, not as a person accused with a drug-related offense, but as human beings together in one place. And we are very thankful that if you ask me in 2016, for example, if this was possible at all, I would have said, I don't think so. But just after this conference on April 21, we're launching a drug policy reform initiative in the Philippines. And part of that initiative are the organization of judges called HUCOM. In fact, we have one of them today at the back. Judge Azon is with us. And I would like to ask your permission, the judge, to share that after our training, you said that you opted to retire early so that you could help us to advocate for decriminalization. So, and I think my time is running out. Things aren't better in the Philippines yet. We still have a lot of people incarcerated for drug-related offenses. Our courts are still overclogged with thousands upon thousands of drug-related offenses. But we'd like to think that there are some pockets of hope. There are some spaces that we can move in, where we can convince even institutions from the criminal justice system to say with us that there is something wrong with this picture, that we don't have to do things this way. And so maybe if you were wondering, what is a Filipina doing in a session called Moving Beyond Criminalization, when the Philippines has the worst examples of human rights violations because of our criminalized, our punitive drug control system? I'd like to think that hopefully in the next harm reduction conference, we'd be able to share better stories. We'd be able to tell you of more and more people coming out to say, we don't want criminalization anymore. We want to change the way things are, and things don't have to be this way. And I hope you continue to support us, because we still very much need your help. Thank you, and good afternoon.
So I'd like to thank our three wonderful speakers, and I think the combination of papers and hearing from experiences in different parts of the world, but also the strong emphasis on identifying how to push for change is a very strong thread coming through these sessions or these papers. What I'd like to do now is to open up for questions. So if anyone does have questions, please make your way to the microphone. Oh, that's even better. Alex Stevens.
Hello, thanks to all three of you for really interesting papers. My name's Alex Stevens from the United Kingdom. I have a question for you, Ted. Thank you for sharing your story of how you've managed to reduce the punishment of people who use drugs and decriminalise the provision of harm reduction materials. Right at the end of your slides, you showed that there was a reduction in punishment for the crime of being in an area where people use drugs, which is an unfamiliar crime to me. I was just trying to work out what that crime is and how would you evidence that somebody is in a place, how do you demarcate a place where people use drugs, and how would the police use that against people who use drugs?
Okay. So basically the policemen just raid drug dens. and if you're found there, you're arrested. Whether you're an outreach worker or a drug user or an advocate providing legal services, you'll be arrested. So the aim of the criminal provision is to, because the government knows drug users take their drugs in dens, so they're trying to eliminate the drug dens, and they also charge the owners of that particular property for letting drug users use the area to take drugs.
So it's just that the police officer defines it as a drug den, and then that's a criminal offence?
Yes, exactly.
I think you were next.
So thank you very much. My name is Wandera. I'm from Kenya. And I would like to ask a question to the lady from the Philippines. Kathy, thank you very much, Kathy. In Kenya, one thing we've tried to do is work with the UNODC, and there's what we have learned. There's a document they produced that shows criminalization does not work. So what we've learned, because our government doesn't listen to us. I mean, you're advocates, you're doing things from the West, those kind of things. So we try to work with that. Has that worked working with the UN agents, is it helping, and what are they saying? Another thing that worked for us is I know Portugal is not like you mentioned, may not be the ideal situation, but it's what we've used. Like, we took our politicians to Portugal and we were like, see, it's working, just see for yourselves. So have you tried to expose your politicians to what's happening outside, and what are they saying? Is there hope? I was just thinking like that.
Thank you for that question. The Philippines right now has an ongoing United Nations joint program. It's a result of the Human Rights Council resolution on human rights in the Philippines, where the different UN agencies are trying to work with the Philippine government agencies. One of the components is the human rights-based approach to drugs. After a lot of legwork on our part, they've finally invited civil society organizations to sit in that technical working group. So myself and another organization, we attend these meetings. And you are right, for the past 6 years, we've been hearing, but those are very Western concepts. It doesn't apply to the culture in the Philippines. In fact, there's a struggle within the meetings because they're trying to insert phrases like culturally sensitive approaches to drugs, which basically means denying harm reduction because it's too Western, something like that. So it's a continuing struggle, and as you can imagine, we are trying to do all of these things on different fronts. So we are working with UN institutions and the UN joint program in the Philippines on one hand, but we can't also put all our eggs in that basket. So we're also trying to do our own work. We have media fellowships to try to shape how the news is being reported. We are trying to reach out to communities where, because stigma and discrimination is still very much rampant, right? And then we also are reaching out to institutions of the criminal justice system. All of these things are happening all at the same time. So you can imagine how stretched we are. That's why it's also important to open up to more allies, because there's just so much work that needs to be done. And so we try to reach out. In fact, I just received a message now trying to invite people to join our network, because more organizations, more individuals would mean more people to share the advocacy work. But we do that, we try to do that. Thank you.
So we have another question.
I've got a couple of questions, if that's all right. Kathy, the first one to you. I think in your presentation you mentioned that someone was remanded in 2021 to have their hearing in 2026. Now, we've got a big problem in Victoria with bail at the moment, where people are being remanded in, at times, really ludicrous circumstances. There's a significant financial impediment on that. I mean, in the Philippines, I'm guessing everyone's feeling the crunch at the moment financially. One would have to say that's going to be pretty burdensome, having people remanded possibly for 5 years plus. Is that a consideration with regard to drug law reform in the Philippines, where just the cost of these nonsensical policies is a burden which the public can't countenance?
We actually try to call their attention to the fact that it costs so much to keep people in pretrial detention. It's just that it's so hard to open the eyes of those who are pretending to be blind. There's no blinder person than those who refuse to see, right? But it doesn't mean we will stop with the effort to try to let them see that. There are also efforts to show comparative cost. It's just that the narrative is still very much but we need to keep our community safe. We need to lock up people who use drugs because they're a danger to community. And so that's why we're also launching all of these media campaigns, trying to change the narrative, because so much is happening and so much needs to be changed. And people who are in pretrial detention in the Philippines also usually have to choose between paying for bail or their families paying for food. And so even if you can afford to pay for bail, many of them would rather, because the bail is so high, it's like equivalent to more than how many sacks of rice, right? So if you are a family member of someone in detention, what would you choose? Rice for the family or paying for bail? Those are some of the decisions that people who are arrested and incarcerated for drug-related offenses in the Philippines have to make. Yeah. I hope I answered your question.
You did. It sounds challenging, but it sort of resonates with what I think a lot of us experience, that criminalisation of things is very emotional rather than evidence-based in the minds of policymakers. Nicole, just a quick question to you. Canada's been sort of the harm reduction mecca from unknowing folk overseas from you, sort of saying, oh, look, you're doing this, you're doing that. But what I've gleaned from your presentation is the political misappropriation of certain harm reduction terms. They're being misused and possibly poorly implemented. We've seen in Victoria, at least, where I work, that you get these positive recommendations or press releases or statements, and then there's these implementation problems that get really tetchy. I was wondering if you could comment on that, maybe beyond, the issue which triggered the policies reforms which you've seen in the last few years, and then the misalignment between what's said and what's done, and if there's a way forward to try to marry that up in a better way. I think I probably asked that in a really bad way. I'm sorry.
I'll try and identify a question. Yeah, thank you. I'm incredibly humbled being on this panel. I just have to say it because we are in a place in Canada where what is happening elsewhere would be unfathomable. That being said, I think because of that, we do have a responsibility to not let ourselves be held up as a panacea. And so I think what we are seeing, certainly in regions that self-identify as more progressive, is kind of not the full replacement of, but the conjoining of kind of criminal and medical forms of social control, right? So where some criminal penalties are being reduced or eliminated, the same kind of regimes of surveillance and punishment if someone deviates from an expected or prescribed path are in play, but under the heading now of you have a disease, therefore you're an unreliable narrator, you can't trust yourself, we can't trust you to maintain employment, housing, et cetera, without these like really firm kind of sets of parameters around behavior. And then that does get framed by politicians and in the media as kindness, right? But the commonalities there are the dehumanization, the lack of trust, and the stigma and discrimination that is still kind of considered valid under those models. So moving beyond it, it's an ongoing strategy question, right? Because on the one hand, forced addiction treatment that may still violate your human rights is probably better than incarceration, right? And certainly everything else that comes with that. but the toll it takes, now I'm speaking from lived experience, when you're told over and over that you're an unreliable narrator, that you have no hope because you have an internal, an intrinsic disease, and you need medical and the medical systems to care for you, that's also no life. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I've answered your question, but certainly for people who are observing Canada, know that medical social control is really firmly entrenched and very seemingly intractable at times. Yeah.
I might take the chair's prerogative and ask a follow-up question for you. Are there any lessons from the experience of decriminalisation efforts in other parts of Canada? So for other provinces, are there any things that you have learnt that could be done differently to hopefully get not a diet decriminalisation, but a full decriminalisation?
Sorry. I mean, the municipality of Toronto in the province of Ontario is moving towards decriminalization. I'd be lying if I said I had all of the nuance there relative BC. I know that thresholds, there has been a different conversation around it, and to my knowledge at this point there will not be thresholds, and that's a huge win. In terms of the advocacy and organizing that has gone into that, it's tough to say what precisely is different. I think the regional variations often come down to the willingness of politicians, police forces, health authorities, etc. But that is something we are definitely keeping a close eye on. Also in Toronto, the kind of mandated fines and penalties and treatment and stuff, to my knowledge, is not currently on the table, although drug confiscation may be. So we are keeping a close eye, but I will return again and again to the need for a national kind of decriminalization program, because otherwise, yes, we do have middling progress in certain areas, and then other provinces, including BC's neighbor, use that really to justify the re-entrenchment of criminalization and to, I would say, politically and culturally distinguish themselves from the places that want to be progressive. Yeah.
So if there's no further questions, I'll ask one more question for someone else, this time for Kathy. So I think, I'd just say huge congratulations for the amazing work you've been doing with the judges in the Philippines. What opportunities, if any, do you see to move into other parts of the judicial system, like the police?
I heard that last, the police. We're trying to expand to other institutions within the criminal justice system, like the public defenders, because a vast majority of people incarcerated for drug-related offenses in the Philippines are represented by the public attorneys. And we want the public attorneys to at least be reminded that their clients are not just envelopes that are stacked high on their desks, but are human beings with lives and families. We're also trying the other side, which are the prosecutors. These are the institutions that we might be able to get some access to, because we are also an organization of lawyers. We're trying to work with our local bar councils to get this started. Hopefully we'd be able to do this in this coming year. As for the police, it's difficult when they continue to have so much power. And all of this power, they've abused so very much. I personally had to deliver a lecture to a group of police officers, and I was trying so hard not to be angry. It's probably one of the most difficult gigs I've ever had to do in my life. So difficult. And then, in the middle of my discussion with this group of police officers, I had to take a call from one of our community women who had an issue of police harassment. So imagine, I'm in this room full of uniformed officers trying very hard not to cuss at them. And then getting a call that one of the women that we work with is actually experiencing harassment from another police in another area. So it's challenging in that they occupy a position in our society where they hold a lot of power, and they've used that power to such an extent that so many people have experienced abuse. And I don't know yet when there will be a space where both our side and the police side would be humble enough to face each other. Because right now I'm still very angry. And I think if you hear the stories that I've heard for the past 6 years, you would understand where my anger is coming from. So maybe we're not yet there.
Unless there are any other questions, I'm going to call this session to a close, but I'd like you all to give a big round of applause, and huge thank you.